On a cold September morning in 1066, a king from the north lay dead in an English field. Harald Hardrada, one of the last great Viking kings, had crossed the sea to claim a crown. Instead, he found the end of an age. His army was broken. His banner was buried in mud. And for a moment, Europe believed the Vikings were finally gone. But history is never that clean. The Vikings were not wiped out in a single battle. They were not hunted into extinction. And they did not simply sail back into the north and vanish. So what really happened to the people who terrified Europe for almost 300 years? Did they disappear? Or did they become the world they once attacked? To understand how the Vikings disappeared, we have to go back to the day Europe first learned to fear them. Not in 1066, but in 793, on a small island monastery called Lindisfarne. For the monks of Lindisfarne, the sea was supposed to be protection. It was distance. It was silence. It was the edge of the known world. Then the ships came out of the fog. They did not look like an army. They did not wait at the gates. They did not fight by the rules Europe understood. The attack on Lindisfarne sent a shock through Christian Europe, not because it was the largest raid, but because it showed something terrifying. The danger did not have to march across borders. It could arrive from the sea, strike without warning, and vanish before a king could answer. Europe had met a new kind of enemy. But the greatest mistake history would make was to think they were only raiders, because the Vikings were not just coming to burn. They were coming to trade, to settle, to rule, and eventually, to change. But before they could disappear, we have to understand what a Viking really was. The word Viking can be misleading. Most of us imagine a single people, a single flag, a single army of horned helmets coming out of the north. But the Viking world was not a modern nation. It was a world of farms, chiefs, ships, families, warriors, poets, slaves, and kings, still trying to become kings. In the simplest sense, to go Viking was to go on an expedition. It could mean raiding. It could mean piracy. It could mean trade. It could mean sailing far from home in search of silver, land, status, or survival. That is why their disappearance is so difficult to explain. You can defeat an army. You can burn a fleet. You can kill a king. But how do you destroy a way of life? The Vikings were never only one thing. To some, they were raiders from the sea. To others, they were merchants with silver scales. To others, settlers building new homes on foreign soil. And to some, they would become rulers. So when we ask why the Vikings disappeared, we are not asking why a bloodline vanished. We are asking why a dangerous identity stopped making sense. If Viking was a way of living, then it could disappear without the people dying. And the first reason it could live at all was wood, sail, and water. The ship was not just transport, it was the weapon. The Viking longship turned geography into a weapon. Europe had walls. It had roads. It had borders. But the Vikings looked at the map differently. They did not see the sea as an edge. They saw it as a road. Their ships were long, narrow, and fast. With a shallow draft, they could move through waters that heavier ships could not. They could cross open seas, slide onto beaches, and push deep into rivers. By the time people saw the sails, it was often too late. This was not just speed. It was surprise. A monastery, a village, even a town could be attacked before any lord had time to gather men. And when the defenders finally came, the attackers could be gone. For early medieval Europe, this was a nightmare. Power moved slowly. Messages moved slowly. Armies moved slowly. The Vikings moved with the wind. But the ship did more than carry warriors. It carried goods. It carried families. It carried rumors, languages, beliefs, and ambitions. And once those ships began to return to the same shores, again and again, something changed. They stopped being visitors. They began to stay. At first, the Vikings seemed like storms. They came from the sea. They struck. They vanished. But storms do not build houses. Storms do not raise children. Storms do not found towns. Over time, many of these men from the north stopped leaving. They took land. They made winter camps permanent. They married. They traded. They learned the rivers, the roads, the languages, and the politics of the places they had once attacked. In Ireland, Viking bases helped grow into some of the first towns. Places like Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Limerick, and Cork became part of a new urban world. The raiders had brought violence, but they also brought ships, trade, coin, craft, and connections. In England, the same transformation happened in different forms. Armies became settlers. Settlers became neighbors. Neighbors became part of the landscape. And once a raider owns land, he is no longer only a raider. Land changes a man. It gives him something to defend. It gives him taxes to collect, alliances to make, neighbors to manage, and children who may never see the northern coast he came from. In the land that would become Normandy, Norse settlers and Frankish society began to merge. Within generations, their descendants would speak a different language, serve different laws, and carry crosses into battle. They were still marked by the North, but they were no longer simply Vikings. The disappearance had begun not with defeat, but with settlement. The popular image of the Viking is a man with an axe, but silver may explain their world better than iron. Violence opened doors. Trade kept them open. In the Viking Age, trade was not a side story. Ports like Hedeby became centers of exchange, where merchants and craftsmen lived behind fortifications, and goods moved between the North Sea, the Baltic, and beyond. Here, the Viking world was not only a battlefield, it was a network. Silver traveled farther than most armies. Coins could come from Christian kingdoms, from Islamic mints, from raids, from ransom, from trade. In a world where wealth could be weighed, melted, cut, and carried, the Vikings were not outside civilization. They were inside its bloodstream. And trade does something war cannot. It creates habit. It creates trust, however fragile. It creates marriages, debts, partnerships, and shared interests. After years of exchange, the foreigner at the dock becomes a man you know, then a neighbor, then family. This is the second reason the Vikings disappeared. They adapted too well. The same flexibility that made them terrifying also made them impossible to keep separate. If raiding failed, they traded. If trade opened a door, they settled. If settlement gave them power, they ruled. Their greatest weapon was not the axe, it was adaptation. In the early Viking world, power was personal. A man followed a leader because that leader could win silver, ships, land, and glory. But personal power is unstable. When the plunder ends, loyalty must be bought again. Kingdoms work differently. As Scandinavian rulers grew stronger, the old world of independent raiders became harder to sustain. Kings wanted control. They wanted taxes, fleets, laws, and obedience. They did not want every ambitious warrior sailing away to make his own war. The North itself was changing. Local power was being pulled into larger kingdoms. The same society that had produced Viking expeditions was becoming more organized, more Christian, more tied to land and law. The old freedom of the sea was being narrowed by the demands of rule. This did not mean violence disappeared. Far from it. Northern kings could still wage war, invade, and fight for crowns. But when violence serves a kingdom, it becomes something different. It becomes policy. It becomes conquest. It becomes royal ambition. Harald Hardrada did not come to England in 1066 as a nameless raider. He came as a king, and that is why his death is so symbolic. The Viking Age did not end because northern men forgot how to fight. It ended because the kind of fighting that defined the Viking had changed. The raider became a landowner. The sea captain became a noble. The war band became an army. And once that happened, the word Viking began to lose its old meaning. But the deepest change did not come from crowns alone. It came from the cross. No change is more intimate than a change of gods. For generations, the Viking world lived with the stories of Odin, Thor, Freya, fate, honor, and the dead who traveled beyond the human world. But by the end of the Viking period, the cross had moved deep into the north. Conversion was not always simple faith. It could be politics. It could be trade. It could be pressure from powerful Christian neighbors. It could be the choice of a ruler who understood that joining Christian Europe opened doors that raiding could not. Christianity changed more than prayer. It changed burial. It changed marriage. It changed law, kingship, diplomacy, and legitimacy. A ruler who accepted the cross could be recognized by other Christian rulers. A people who entered the church entered a wider European order. This is where the disappearance becomes quiet. There was no final day when every Viking took off his old identity. No single king declared the Viking Age dead. Instead, the signs changed. The dead were buried differently. The kings spoke a different political language. The children grew up inside a different story. When the sons of raiders were baptized, raised on farms, bound to kings, and buried under crosses, what exactly remained of the Viking? The blood remained. The memories remained. The stories remained. But the old way of living was fading. They did not need to be conquered by Europe. They were entering it. So who killed the Viking Age? Not one king. Not one battle. Not one army. The answer is a chain of changes. First, Europe learned. Raids that once arrived as a shock became a threat rulers planned for. Defenses improved. Kingdoms became better at responding. The easy targets became fewer. Second, the Vikings settled. A man who has no land can chase silver across the sea. A man with fields, children, and neighbors must think differently. Settlement turned motion into roots. Third, the North became kingdoms. The old world of independent raiders could not survive the rise of stronger kings. Kings pulled ships, warriors, taxes, and violence into royal power. Raiding became harder to separate from state war. Fourth, the cross changed the language of power. Christianity changed burial, marriage, law, kingship, diplomacy, and legitimacy. To trade, marry, rule, and negotiate with Christian Europe, northern rulers entered Christian Europe. Defense, settlement, kingship, Christianity. And that is why the Viking Age did not end like a myth. There was no final funeral ship burning on the edge of the world. No last roar beneath a black sky. The world that created the Vikings had disappeared, and the Vikings changed with it. So where did they go? They went into the places they had once attacked. Into England. Into Ireland. Into Normandy. Into the islands, rivers, markets, farms, churches, and kingdoms of Europe. Some became settlers. Some became traders. Some became rulers. Some became Christians. Some became the ancestors of people who would never call themselves Vikings at all. That is the strange ending of the Viking Age. The people remained, but the name changed. The weapons remained, but the purpose changed. The ships remained, but the world they sailed through was no longer the same. By 1066, Harald Hardrada could still cross the sea with an army. He could still fight for a crown. He could still look, in many ways, like the last echo of the Viking world. But even he came not as a wandering raider. He came as a king. And when he fell, it was not the death of a people. It was the closing of an identity. The Vikings did not disappear because they lost. They disappeared because they changed. And in changing, they became part of the world that once feared them.